I still remembered the exact moment everything started because it wasn't some dramatic confrontation or flashing police lights. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon after work, the kind of afternoon where you kick your boots off, grab a bottle of water, and walk your backyard just to clear your head before dinner. I've always liked doing that. My wife used to joke that I knew every inch of our property better than I knew the inside of my own garage. Maybe she was right. We'd bought that place almost 12 years earlier outside a small town in northern Missouri, back when the neighborhood still had more empty lots than houses. Every maple tree we planted, every flower bed we built, every fence post we replaced over the years carried a memory. So when something changes on your own land, you notice it immediately. As I walked toward the back corner near the old vegetable garden, I stopped so suddenly I almost dropped my water bottle. Sitting there, just beyond the cedar fence, was a brand new gray vinyl storage shed. It looked expensive. Clean white trim, fresh roof panels, shiny hardware. Somebody had spent real money on it. The only problem was that one entire corner wasn't sitting on my neighbor's property. It was sitting on mine. I actually laughed at first because it seemed too ridiculous to be real. I rubbed my eyes, took another few steps, and stared at the concrete foundation blocks underneath it. Nope, I wasn't imagining things. The footing crossed well past where my old garden border used to run. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered to myself. My neighbor, whose name was no longer Marcus but Ryan Callahan in this version of the story, had only lived next door for about a year. At first, he seemed friendly enough. He was the kind of guy who always had a new project going, always buying expensive tools, always telling everyone how he could do contractors' work better than contractors. There was a confidence about him that people either admired or quietly rolled their eyes at. I tried to stay somewhere in the middle. We'd wave when grabbing the mail, occasionally chat about football, and that was about it. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either, at least not yet. I walked over and found Ryan sitting on his back deck drinking iced tea like he didn't have a care in the world. "Hey Ryan," I called. He smiled. "What's up, neighbor?" I pointed toward the shed. "I think you've got a problem." He looked confused for about half a second before following my finger. "Looks fine to me. That shed is on my property." He actually chuckled, not nervous laughter, genuine amusement, like I'd just told a funny joke. "Nah," he said, standing up and walking over. "The property line's over there." He pointed at a row of decorative landscaping stones running between our yards. I stared at them for a moment. Those stones hadn't been there when I bought the house. In fact, I remembered him putting them down the previous summer during one of his weekend landscaping projects. "Ryan," I said calmly, "those are decorative rocks. They aren't survey markers." He shrugged. "Previous owner told me that's where the line was." I folded my arms. "Well, my paperwork says something different." He smiled again, except this time it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile people wear when they've already convinced themselves they're right. "Look," he said, "it's just a storage shed. Even if it's a few inches over, who cares?" That sentence bothered me more than the shed itself. It wasn't about the building anymore. It was about the attitude behind it. It was the assumption that my property somehow became negotiable simply because correcting the mistake would inconvenience him. I didn't argue. I've learned over the years that once somebody decides facts are optional, raising your voice rarely changes anything. Instead, I simply nodded and said, "We'll find out." I turned around and walked back home while I could still feel his eyes on my back. The first thing I did was dig through the file cabinet in my office until I found the thick folder labeled Property Documents. Inside was the original survey from when we purchased the house. I spread it across my dining room table, grabbed a flashlight because the print was tiny, and started comparing measurements. Within 10 minutes, my stomach tightened. The decorative stones weren't just wrong, they were nearly 18 inches inside my property, which meant the shed wasn't barely over the line, it was well into my yard. I sat there staring at the survey for a long time, remembering something my father used to tell me whenever we'd work on fences together. "Good fences don't make good neighbors," he'd say. "Respect does." Looking back now, that sentence carried a lot more weight than I understood as a kid. The next morning, before I even left for work, I called a licensed survey company. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I wanted facts that nobody could dismiss. If I was wrong, I'd apologize. If Ryan was wrong, then we'd see how confident those landscaping stones really were. At that point, I still believed this could be solved with a simple conversation. A handshake, maybe even an apology. I had absolutely no idea that one storage shed was about to uncover something much bigger about the man living next door. And before the week was over, neither one of us would ever look at that property line the same way again. The survey crew showed up Thursday morning while I was at work, but I'd arranged to leave early because I wanted to be there when they started. If you've never watched professional surveyors work, it's honestly fascinating. They don't guess, right? They don't eyeball things. They don't care whose feelings get hurt. They work from legal descriptions, GPS coordinates, historical monuments, and measurements that have probably existed longer than either homeowner has been alive. 2 trucks pulled into my driveway just after 1 o'clock, and within minutes they had bright orange tripods, electronic equipment, and stacks of fluorescent pink flags spread across both yards. Ryan noticed almost immediately. I saw him peek through his kitchen window 3 different times before finally walking outside with that same confident swagger he'd worn a couple of days earlier. Little overkill, don't you think? He called across the fence. One of the surveyors barely looked up before answering. Sir, we just measure property. That's all we do. I couldn't help smiling. There was something comforting about having people involved who didn't care about neighborhood politics. They only cared about facts. For nearly 2 hours they moved methodically across both lots, checking old corner monuments buried beneath years of grass, verifying bearings, recording elevations, comparing coordinates with county records. Every few minutes another pink flag appeared in the ground. By the time they finished, the true property line looked nothing like Ryan's decorative stone border, not even close. The lead surveyor walked over carrying a clipboard and pointed toward the corner of the shed. Mr. Bennett, he said, your neighbor's structure extends approximately 23 inches beyond the legal boundary onto your parcel. Hearing someone else say it out loud somehow made it more real. 23 inches. Less than 2 feet. Some people might hear that and think, what's the big deal? But property ownership doesn't work on feelings. 23 inches today becomes 3 feet tomorrow. Then somebody builds a fence. Then another owner comes along 20 years later claiming adverse possession. And suddenly a simple mistake turns into a legal nightmare. I thanked the survey crew, signed the paperwork, and they handed me a certified report complete with photographs, GPS coordinates, and stamped documentation. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. Clear, professional, impossible to argue with. Ryan wandered over before they had even finished packing their equipment. So, he asked, folding his arms. I handed him the survey without saying a word. He skimmed the first page, flipped through the photographs, paused when he saw the highlighted measurements, then handed it back almost dismissively. It's just a shed, he said. Nobody's getting hurt. I looked directly at him. Ryan, it's a permanent structure sitting on land you don't own. Come on, man. He laughed. We're neighbors. Can't we just agree to move the line over? For a second, I honestly wondered whether he understood what he was asking. You can't move property boundaries because they're inconvenient, I replied. That's not how ownership works. His smile faded for the first time. So what now? Now you move your shed. He shook his head slowly. Not happening. There it was. The conversation I'd hoped would solve everything had officially ended. I didn't threaten him. I didn't yell. I simply thanked him for his time, walked back inside, scanned every page of the survey into my computer, and filed a complaint with the county zoning and permitting office before dinner. The woman who answered the phone listened patiently while I explained the situation. When I mentioned I had a certified survey documenting an encroachment involving a permitted accessory structure, her tone changed immediately. Please email everything you've got, she said. We'll assign an inspector. 4 days later, a county inspector named Laura Jennings pulled into the neighborhood in a white pickup with the county seal on the door. She introduced herself, reviewed the survey, then walked the property with a tape measure, laser rangefinder, and a copy of Ryan's building permit she'd already retrieved from county records. I stayed quiet while she worked because I knew this wasn't my investigation anymore. About 30 minutes later, she walked over to Ryan's driveway where he was waiting with his arms crossed. I couldn't hear every word at first, but I heard enough. Mr. Ed Callahan, she said, did you obtain this permit using a site plan you drew yourself? Yeah, he answered confidently. The county approved it. Laura nodded. The county approved the location shown on your drawing. The problem is your drawing doesn't match the legal survey. Ryan frowned. The previous owner showed me where the line was. Laura didn't even blink. Verbal information from a previous owner doesn't override recorded property boundaries. That sentence landed like a hammer. Ryan's shoulders dropped just a little. She continued explaining that permits authorize construction only if the submitted information is accurate. They don't magically legalize building on someone else's land. I watched him search for another argument. Well, nobody checked before approving it. Because applicants are responsible for providing accurate information, Laura replied. The county isn't responsible for verifying every hand-drawn sketch against private surveys. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Instead of admitting the mistake, though, Ryan doubled down. He's making a big deal over nothing. Laura slowly turned toward my yard, then back toward the shed. Whether it's 2 inches or 20 feet isn't the issue, she said. Encroachment is encroachment. She handed him a printed notice. You have 30 days to relocate or remove the structure. Beginning on day 31, daily civil penalties will apply until compliance is achieved. I watched Ryan read the notice twice. The confidence I'd seen all week was disappearing in real time. That evening, my wife, Emily, came home from work and found me grilling burgers in the backyard. She looked toward the pink survey flag still standing in the grass and smiled. Looks like something happened today. I handed her a glass of iced tea and filled her in on everything. She listened quietly before asking the same question I'd been asking myself. Do you think he knew? I stared toward the shed for several seconds before answering. I honestly don't know anymore. If Ryan had simply trusted those decorative stones, I could understand the mistake. But after seeing the survey, after hearing the inspector explain everything, after receiving an official order, he was choosing not to accept reality. That wasn't confusion anymore. That was pride. The weekend arrived, and right around 10 Saturday morning there was a knock on my front door. Ryan stood there looking exhausted, holding the violation notice in one hand. Gone was the confident grin. Gone was the easy swagger. Can we talk? He asked. We stepped onto the porch. He sighed heavily before speaking. Look, moving that shed's going to cost me thousands. Probably, I answered. The contractor says I'll have to tear up the foundation and rebuild it. I nodded. Probably. He stared at me for a few seconds, clearly waiting for sympathy that never came. Isn't there something we can work out? He finally asked. Like what? Maybe an easement. Maybe you lease me that corner. I almost laughed. Not because the idea itself was ridiculous, but because of the timing. Ryan, I said calmly, you never asked before you built it. You told me it wasn't my property. You told me those rocks were the boundary. Now you're asking me to solve a problem you created. His jaw tightened. So you're really going to make me tear it down? I shook my head. No, the county is. I'm just asking for my property back. He didn't say another word. He turned, walked down my driveway, and climbed into his truck. For the next 2 weeks, the shed never moved. Every morning I left for work expecting to see contractors. Every evening I came home expecting progress. Nothing changed. The deadline kept getting closer, and I started wondering whether Ryan actually believed the county was bluffing. Then day 31 arrived, and everything changed faster than either of us expected. On the morning of day 31, I backed out of my driveway with my coffee in one hand and noticed something taped to Ryan's front door. Even from the street, I knew what it was. The county had posted a formal non-compliance notice, and from that day forward, the fines were no longer theoretical. Every single day that shed remained on my property was going to cost him money. Funny thing about consequences, they have a way of changing people's priorities. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a message from one of my neighbors. Looks like your guy finally hired a crew. Sure enough, when I got home that afternoon, there was a trailer parked in Ryan's driveway. 2 contractors were removing siding panels from the shed, and a small excavator sat beside the concrete footings. Nobody looked happy. Ryan saw me pull in, glanced my way for just a second, then looked back at the ground. There wasn't any anger left on his face anymore, just frustration, and maybe a little embarrassment. I didn't walk over. I didn't make a comment. I didn't stand there enjoying the show. Honestly, there wasn't much satisfaction in watching someone spend thousands of dollars fixing a mistake that never should have happened. The satisfaction came from something much simpler than that. The rules had worked exactly the way they were supposed to work. Facts had mattered. Documents had mattered. Professional measurements had mattered. Nobody won because they talked louder. Nobody won because they were stubborn. The truth simply caught up with reality. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched that entire structure disappear piece by piece. First the roof came off, then the walls, then the flooring. Finally, the contractor lifted the heavy concrete foundation blocks that had been sitting on my property since the whole mess began. I stood in my backyard one evening after they were gone. looking at the strip of ground where my wife's flower bed had once been. The dirt was torn up from construction equipment, but for the first time in over a month, it was mine again. A few days later, I noticed fresh framing going up farther inside Ryan's yard. This time, he wasn't guessing. Bright survey stakes were still standing everywhere, and every few hours, one of the contractors would stop to double-check measurements before fastening another board into place. I couldn't help smiling a little. Apparently, 23 inches had become the most carefully measured distance in the entire neighborhood. About a week after the new shed was finished, Ryan walked across the property line carrying 2 small bags of grass seed. He stopped several feet away and cleared his throat. I figured I should replace what got torn up. I looked at the bags, then back at him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, he sighed. I should have listened when you showed me the survey. It wasn't a dramatic apology. There were no speeches, no excuses, no emotional breakthrough, just one honest sentence. And somehow, that was enough. Yeah, I answered quietly. You probably should have. He nodded once. I let my pride get in the way. I appreciated that he didn't blame the county, the contractor, the previous owner, or even those decorative landscaping stones. He owned it. That's something a lot of people never learn to do. We spent the next half hour spreading grass seed over the damaged section together. We didn't become best friends afterward. We didn't start grilling burgers every weekend or watching football together. But something had changed. We both understood where the line actually was. Not just the one marked by survey pins, but the invisible line between respecting someone else's property and assuming your convenience matters more than their rights. A month later, I noticed something that made me laugh out loud. Ryan had completely removed every decorative stone he'd once insisted marked the property boundary. In their place, he installed 2 simple flower beds entirely inside his own yard, leaving plenty of room between them and the actual survey markers. Sometimes the best lessons are expensive ones. Looking back, people occasionally ask whether I regret filing the complaint instead of just letting it go. My answer is always the same. If I'd ignored it because it was only a couple of feet, what would happen the next time? What happens when the next owner buys that house, believing the shed has always been in the right place? What happens when another fence gets built using the same bad assumptions? Property disputes don't become easier by avoiding them. They become more expensive. The truth is, this story was never really about a storage shed. It was about respect. Respect for boundaries, respect for ownership, and respect for the simple idea that admitting you're wrong is a whole lot cheaper than defending a mistake until the government forces you to fix it. And maybe that's the part that stuck with me the most. Winning never felt as important as proving that calm persistence beats arrogance almost every single time. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have let the shed stay to keep the peace? Or would you have done exactly what I did and insisted on protecting every inch of your property? And if you were Ryan, at what point would you have admitted you were wrong? Let me know down in the comments, because I've seen people argue both sides of stories like this for hours. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with a difficult neighbor. Trust me, you're definitely not the only one with a story like this.